I will talk about environmental autonomy. It's a very new concept. Actually, it's an emerging concept under international law, and I'm trying to draw the framework, legal framework for this concept, and it's still in progress. So I have right now an identification. I'm not saying a definition, because definition is something very serious under law legal aspect. So it's just right now identification, but it's based on the recent research. So I will call it as the narrow identification, because I think also a broad identification of the concept of environmental autonomy will be based on the recent research. As you see now, I will focus on the culture of the indigenous peoples as case study, and I will try to make a comparative analysis in between the Scandinavian countries, which have Sami people in themselves, so Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Yes? This is my outline. I will try to do my best, Flavia, to not waste the time, hopefully. So I will try to make a very short overview on the environmental autonomy, but based on the recent research, as I said, as in progress, and indigenous peoples' cultural rights, but particularly I will try to focus on the rights of the land rights of the indigenous people. Why? Because there are special ties to the land rights and environmental autonomy, environmental issues of the indigenous peoples. And then I will try to make a comparative analysis. It will include some tables, and I will just mention the very important points. If you ask questions, then we can make a detailed overview of this case study as well. As you see, I have many questions. These are the main ones. And the main one for this research is actually whether environmental autonomy can play a positive role for improving indigenous peoples' cultural rights, as we have a case study, cultural rights, a comparative analysis, and of course, concept of environmental autonomy. And some detailed questions I have as well to make these basic questions, to give these basic questions, to answer the basic questions in a more detailed way. I will try to make a comparison in between the regulations, implementations of cultural rights in Finland, Norway, and Sweden. And as different from the other speakers, actually, I'm just focusing on the indigenous peoples, because all the others are more focusing on the national minorities. And how does the protection and promotion of the right to culture, specifically for Sami people, and focusing on human rights, international human rights law for this research. But you will see for environmental autonomy, actually, I'm also trying to touch on the international environmental law in addition to the international human rights law. And to what extent is the right to culture protected? Again, human rights instruments, how effective they are, and how the basic question, how can a sort of environmental autonomy concept can contribute to their protection. Yes. And environmental autonomy, how we can not define, as I said, identify the concept for now in this research under international law. I have some criteria, type of autonomy, legal basis, scope, substance, and implementations. Of course, for this very short time, actually, I'm not concerning about the implementation part. From your research, as we see, the implementation parts always is the weakest parts of the research, because it's not easy to find the data, etc. But I think it should be also a variable for making this kind of research on the concept of environmental autonomy. But I think in the longer term, for now, I am focusing on the type of autonomy, legal basis, scope, and substance. Yes. On the basis of this analysis, I'm making an identification on the environmental autonomy. As you see here, what I said, this is the narrow identification. I identify it as a human right of indigenous peoples or other traditional local communities and to govern themselves related to mostly environmental issues, and to manage environmental protection, to control environmental degradation. This is an identification made based on the environmental autonomy approach based on the environmentalist perspective, collectivity-based, culturally sensitive approach towards rights. So here in this research, actually, I'm more focusing on the rights issues, but environmentalist perspective means here ecosystem-based perspective. So why I said that this is a narrow definition, narrow identification, because a broader identification will include possibly the right to the environment, of the right of the human rights to environment, but also the rights of the animals, the rights of the nature, and somehow, to some extent, actually, the legality, the legal status of the nature itself. So a broader identification mostly not will be just about the rights of the human rights, but also rights of the nature itself, and so it will cover a broader perspective than this one. Yes. And on the basis of this identification, and this research is more related to human rights law and the cultural rights of the indigenous people, I have thought that I can be based on this definition, this narrow definition, as a human right of the indigenous or local traditional communities. So here, as it is so related to so tied to the land rights issues, there are two main things. And as you see here in the slide as well, they have also legal bases under international law with these covenant conventions. So the first one is full enjoyment of universal human rights, but at the same time, collective rights, group rights as well. The second one of culture, and the culture here again in this research is identified in a broader terms, so including the land rights as well. So here we have rights of lands, natural resources, and it's not just including the usage rights, but also ownership, possession as well, and also property rights as well. Yes. And when we look at the Sami people, and on the basis of these three countries, what is the current situation of them? As you know, I think, there is a draft convention, Sami Convention, which is still in progress, and it started to be negotiated in 2005, and the negotiations ended 2017, but still it is being debated under the Sami parliaments and the governmental institutions, so there is no approval about the draft convention. So here, of course I will not go in details then, but what I will just try to take your attention to some main points. For example, the way of the self-determination of the Sami people formulation in this convention, and external self-determination is very important because autonomy is really in general understood as the internal self-determination, so mostly cultural autonomy or non-territorial autonomy, but we see here there are some references to the external self-determination in limited ways. How in limited ways? I mean that to form some international organizations, to be represented in international organizations, to somehow have legal status under international law. So it's very important, and it's a very improvement basis issue, I think, for the indigenous people. And again, culture here, we see in the interdependency in between, again, land rights, culture and self-determination of Sami people in this convention, and this is a very good improvement for the Sami people again. And the form of autonomy, here there is a blurred definition, identification about the form of autonomy. So it is, because of that actually, external self-determination and the type of autonomy is the two key issues which is making the convention not approved till to that time. And the rights of consultation, FIPIC principle is very important, I think, for the representation of these people in the governmental institutions. FIPIC means free, prior informed consent. So when there is a decision which is particularly related to the Sami people's issues, then this means that you have to go to the Sami parliaments or the organizations of the Sami people and get approval them, and then you can decide on this issue. And of course, the rights character is very important from the perspective of law. Why? Because if it's an individual-based rights, you have different rights and obligations. If it's a collective-based rights, you have different rights and obligations. And the most important and resulting in crisis, the lands issue. Here is I think, one of the key issues of the draft convention, because there is still going on debates on this issue, because these lost lands issue and the right to non-traditional natural resources of Sami people is not still a solved issue for these countries as well, for these Norway, Sweden and Finland, these countries as well. Yes. And as you see, we will have, if you can show very quickly all of them, we will have, as you see, these kind of different comparative analysis tables, but I will try to just again take your attention to the main points of them. If we can start from the first one. The first one, go back. As you see here, I started with the general information and tried to see the similarities and the differences in between these countries. And as you see, regional basis is so similar for all of them because they are at the same region. And the population, again, as you see, there are differences in between them. Why? Because in Sweden, in 20,000s, in 8,000s, in Finland, and this population location is so important because, for example, in Finland, so distributed, but in Norway, in some parts of the country, again, there are differences. And estimated total number actually at around 100,000. And political representation, as you see, all of them, for all of them actually, there are parliaments, and in these parliaments they can be represented. And there is another very important institution over the parliament, semi-parliamentary council, and again this council is very important institution to make them to make their voice heard by their communities. Yes. And here, covenants. Why I said this research is mostly based on the human rights law, human rights covenants, ILO Convention, UNRIP, and the Nordic Sami Convention. As I said, Nordic Sami Convention is in progress, but ILO Convention ratified just by the Norway, and UNRIP by all of them approved, and so it's a very good case for all these countries. Yes. And the others, they are already party to these international human rights covenants. And as you see here, we have as the criteria variable of this research, constitutional basis, parliamentary acts, institutional autonomy, impact of the parliament, and also customary Sami law and traditional Sami social structure. I think I got this criteria for the next table as well because it's very important. Why? Because as you see, customary Sami law, traditional Sami social structure, even there is a very important progress in these countries regarding the indigenous people's rights. As you see, this customary law and the traditional social structure largely ignored, and this is the one mostly criticized by the scholars. Why? Because there are of course some institutions, some legalization, codification, but still there is a gap regarding the customary Sami law and traditional Sami social structures. Land rights, usage and ownership is very important. So related to environmental autonomy as well. As you see here, for Finland, there is not a full ownership, but Norway is the most progressed one here. Why? Because there is a special act, Finnmark Estate and Finnmark Act signed in 2005, and so according to this act we see that they can have a collective ownership in a land. and there is a sample case for this in Norway, actually Troms country. But for Sweden and Finland, we cannot say this. But still, by the case law in Sweden, very recently, 2020, as you see, again, district, Girsaj district, this is a Sami reindeer herding community. We see that they won their case against the Swedish government to manage their hunting and other facilities, traditional facilities in their region. And reindeer husbandry is very important for this region, but for other regions, for other indigenous people, there can be some other kinds of facilities as well. But for this region, reindeer husbandry is very important. Again, here we have acts, special acts, which is determining the rights of these people in these acts. And the next one. And as you see here, on the basis of this analysis, I found out that there is still, on the basis of this environmental autonomy approach, which is involving the ecosystem approach as well, which is still in progress, it should be further improved. There is still need to establish some other institutions concerning about their customary law and also social traditional knowledge and social structures as well. So we need to have some legal and administrative amendments. But I see that if this environmental autonomy approach can be understood well enough, then we can see as not just see from the perspective of human rights law, but the rights of the ecosystem as well, then it will be evaluated under not just the rights of the human beings and indigenous people, but will be seen in a broader perspective with the rights of the ecosystem as well. So there will be a win-win situation. Indigenous people, because of their spatial ties to the land rights, natural resources, environmental issues, win. At the same time, the environment ecosystem will also win. Thank you.
So it's a very new concept and
Yes.
a new approach. Yes. So I ask you, who has a question? Okay.
I have a question. I was very interested in this presentation because it refers to one of the minorities in the Baltic Sea region, and I've just finished my research about the role of territorial cooperation concerning all minorities in the whole Baltic Sea region, and one of the results was that this minority may be the case study of good practices, because nearly 80% of the cross-border cooperation projects were dealing with Sami minority. But my question is that one of the projects, I know only from the theory, because you know the reality, one of the project concerned the initiative to create so-called Sami Council. So my question is, theoretically, the Sami Council includes the fourth partner, which is Russia. So I have to...
As you see in my research, there is no Russia.
I have to ask that question. How do you think is it possible to compare data from these other countries in Russia?
Actually, Russia's position... Please go on.
And
if you...
Second, what do you think about the practical role of Sami Council, including the Russian partner?
Okay, thank you.
Disregarding the now the contemporary situation, yeah.
Yes.
Previously, when the war started.
Any other questions?
Yes, Marina.
Thank you very much. This is, as Lara said, it's a very interesting topic. Of course, it's up to date. It looks for the environmental issues as well, and as well as minorities, which is something that we are very concerned on in today's contemporary world. I was wondering your personal research. You will continue, of course, in this area to find the appropriate model. But would you think that you will find some difficulties, because the world in general faces a lot of fear of land degradation, lack of water, the rich natural resources of states are going down in the resourcefulness. It is good that they're connected with, of course, national indigenous people and minorities. In the case, of course, the Sami is a very excellent case and model. But do you think that that will be a challenge for your research? Because there are also many international conventions, international law that are abolished use of weapons, right? Missiles with medium range. This is also something that influenced a lot, especially Ukrainian, Russian.
Yes.
Russian war influenced a lot of environmental impact and climate change. How do you see these challenges, which are very big for
Yes.
researchers in terms of environment?
Sure. I'm working on this issue for more than 2 years, and still I cannot make an identification on the concept of environmental autonomy. Still working, just making an identification on the concept itself under legal terms. So any other question? No. Okay, I can start. Toby, I think. Thomas, question. Actually, I couldn't get Russia into this analysis research. Why? Because it has some different specialties in itself. So regarding this council issue, again, the minorities. Indigenous peoples are minorities, but at the same time having a special status because of the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous People, UNDRIP. So they have both the rights of the individuals because of the international human rights law, also the minorities' rights, but also having a special status indigenous people's rights as well. So the institutional organization in Russia is going on by mostly with the non-governmental organizations, not these kinds of parliaments or parliamentary councils. So they are trying to make their voice heard by the governmental institutions, by the non-governmental organizations. How it functions, it is effective or not in practice, I don't know, because I didn't go in details about the Russia case. Why I didn't get Russia as a sample case study for the Sami people, actually because these three cases have similarities, many similarities in themselves, but Russia is totally different. So if I took it to this analysis, it will make my actually research more complicated than this one. It is already very complicated because of the concept of environmental autonomy.
I totally 100% agree with you, because when I deal with Baltic Sea region issues, I have exactly the same problem, because data
Russia, yes.
totally not comparable.
And it's not easy to find to lead to the data as well regarding these people, etc. And I make my STSM by the Entan to the Finland, for example, and make some interviews with people, scholars working on these issues. And I don't think that I could, in this Ukrainian-Russia war case situation, I could find an opportunity to make this kind of research or interviews with Russian scholars and others. So I couldn't get it into the research. Regarding the concept, Marina, yes, you are absolutely right. As I said, more than 2 years, I'm just working on how I can define. I cannot say define, because definition something means something, makes sense under international law, under law. So I'm just now saying that identification, how I can identify. I started with the rights of the human rights, but make interviews with Christina Sahlin and Professor Malgosia Fismoris, and then they directed me to work on a little bit the right to environment and also the rights of the natural resources as well. Why? Because particularly in the South America, I think there are some regulations which is making giving the legality status to the nature as well, to the rivers, to the mountains, etc., etc. So as a larger concept, perhaps it can be also identified in the rights of the ecosystem and rights of the natural resources as well. But as you said, it's totally challenging for me because there is no any article research or something on the concept itself. I'm just trying to find a way for myself, but I think I am coming to the end of the road, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yes, David.
Just if I could, Zerrin, you reminded me, I mean, obviously I've worked with Christina Celine, but I'd also put her in touch with a colleague in Glasgow because it reminded me because you mentioned the Latin American context and the rights of rivers, a colleague called Mo Hume who has been working on precisely these issues. So just to say I'd be interested to talk further, possibly cooperate and bring you in touch.
Hopefully, because it's really challenging for me to try to, as a Turkish academician, to try to understand, to try to work on. Actually, because of the Entan, I started to work on environmental autonomy. I was working just on environmental law and climate law specifically, but I'm so glad to have this as a research actually, because it's very, for me, exciting as well to try to find a way to make it, and even as an emerging concept, to be studied and worked in the literature. So thank you. If you can, but I benefited from your, as I said, from your that educative from the Entan website. Webinars actually, because most of the interviews I made from that speakers of these webinars. So thank you again for these webinars as well.
Okay, thank you.